Welcome. This is Heelhooked MMA podcast. This is our bonus one for this week. We're going to recap UFC 205.
Heck yeah.
I'm Anthony Iozzo,
We got Big Drew over here.
and let's just dive right into this. Let's start.
Well, some big things happen obviously in this fight card. We'll kick it right off with what transpired in the main event. We got some big numbers here. He is the ninth lightweight champion in UFC history. He becomes that following Jens Pulver, Sean Shirk, BJ Penn, Frankie Edgar, Benson Henderson, Anthony Pettis, Rafael Dos Anjos, and then obviously Eddie Alvarez. So Mark's the only the ninth lightweight champion in organization's history. Third fighter to have two UFC titles in their career. Obviously Randy Couture and BJ Penn being the other two. But he is the first to hold that belt, those belts consecutively. Obviously kind of a technicality with the 145 belt likely to be stripped. And that's at least what the significance of the night. We can dive into the actual numbers of what we saw during the fight. We'll talk about obviously McGregor's accuracy, his significant strikes, and his knockdowns. Yeah. If you want to start that off, we can start talking about his striking.
So let's say first the fight lasted 2 rounds, and just McGregor had a beautiful combo to sort of finish Alvarez off. But you look at his strikes. 40 total strikes, 32 significant strikes. And when you look at the percentages, he was 43% overall, right. 38% with the significant. And so you can see most of his shots he did hit were significant. Where when you look at Alvarez, he only had 12 total strikes, only 9 significant strikes. So he also had big ones, but only 26%
right.
total. So he was down. He was also 0 for 3 in takedowns,
right.
which is pretty much what he needed to do. Is he needed to wrestle, and he wasn't able to do that. That's what that shows. He was knocked down 3 times too. Obviously, the last one. So.
And a big thing with those 3 knockdowns, McGregor becomes the second guy ever, third guy ever to be able to score 3 knockdowns in 2 fights in their career. Those other 2 guys being Anderson Silva and John Lineker. So big deal landing those 3 knockdowns. Clearly Eddie, and he admitted this after the fight, was willing to be baited into the brawl by McGregor, which obviously we talked about in our breakdown previously. We feel that he was baited into it by McGregor, and he paid. He should have stuck with the wrestling. McGregor defended those takedowns, but he allowed McGregor to dictate where that fight took place. He allowed himself to get backed up against the cage, and he got picked off, and he ultimately paid for it. So, any other significant numbers on that one?
That's pretty much what I saw. I mean, like you said, you're talking about the wrestling, and when I see 0 for 3 in takedowns, first of all, only going for 3 takedowns. I know it's only 2 rounds, but it shows that he was much rather trying to get into a boxing match. And when you look 40 to 12 in strikes, that didn't go so well. So I mean, to be honest, that's what I take, is that he wasn't able to score 1 takedown. And we talked about the one weakness, if you could pick one out of McGregor, is getting him on the ground, and that didn't happen. So.
Right. I mean, and again, his takedown defense, while we questioned it against Chad Mendes, and we could
it was pretty good.
He's clearly made improvements there.
You can tell he practiced that.
Right. And then I guess the other big thing about the McGregor fight is obviously the news that came afterwards. Now, it sounds like there's some other big announcements that are on the horizon, but the one he did drop last night is what we did know is he was having a child, but it sounds like kind of what we were expecting. He is not going to be most likely fighting until he has that child, so that's probably most likely May. So I could see him fighting maybe June, July next year, which maybe gets something good to match up with the return of John Jones in July, if that were to work out that way. So
that would be a super fight.
We could see him come back and then have the right type of fighters available to fill out a card, a McGregor type card. We'll see if his request to be involved in the business, getting some shares in that business, getting some stake in it. I think that is something that the UFC is going to have to address with their pay structure, with the way that they deal with fighters. They're going to consistently have fighters as they ascend and become a large part of the success of the business. They're going to see fighters start to pull for things like this, and In the NFL, there is that revenue sharing between the organizations and the players, and that is a thing that fighters are going to start bringing up more and more. Seems to be the first domino to fall with the biggest name in the business really calling for that.
Yeah.
As guys climb that ladder, they're going to start to make those same determinations on their self-worth, I guess, continuing in the company. So, I guess if we want to move on, then do we need to? We'll get to the welterweight battle now. Obviously, this is a little bit of an odd one. We end the fight, unfortunately, with the third draw in UFC championship fight history, following BJ Penn and Uno, as well as Edgar Maynard for UFC 125. Those two being the only time previous that there had been a draw in the championship fight. Obviously, majority draw. Now, both you and I tend to disagree that that anyone should have scored at a draw. I can maybe see where it was possible, but to be honest, I feel like Woodley, when you look at the striking numbers, seem to have the advantage. His ability to land on the feet as well as on the ground when he had him rocked. And again, you got to think, had Thompson been able to, had he not had freakish ability to hold off that submission.
Yeah, the fourth round was crazy.
Yeah, that fourth round was one of the most insane rounds in terms of survival that I think anyone's had in at least recent history. So I guess what do the numbers tell us?
Let's look at the numbers because the numbers are very favorable for Woodley here. First of all, when we talk about control, octagon control, 4 minutes and 59 seconds. They gave Woodley only 2 minutes and 29 seconds for Thompson. I mean, that's a big indicator of how many rounds Woodley had the control. It strikes 113 to 60 for Woodley, 57% for Woodley, only 33% for Thompson. So he was missing a lot. Definitely not working his kick like some of the keys you talked about.
Right.
Significant strikes, 61 to 43. But the difference there is the accuracy, 43% for Woodley, only 26% for Thompson. So he just wasn't getting those big hits. They didn't really do a lot of takedowns, but the one takedown Woodley got, he almost submitted him. It was amazing that Woodley was able to survive that. And of course, there was the one knockdown as well, where we thought it might have been over there when he got knocked down to the ground and then punched a couple more times.
He definitely went out on a standing. One interesting thing, though, too, to note, I mean, as much as we talked about Woodley dominating in every phase of that fight, he did land one takedown in the fight, but we do have to remember about Woodley, and this fight was perfect evidence of that. He has wrestling. He does not really go for takedowns. He uses that wrestling once he gets you down. It's actually only his fourth takedown in UFC history. Those three previous came in one fight. That fight against Carlos Condit. So in reality, this is his second fight that he's ever thrown a takedown. So that is something to keep in mind moving forward. We'll see if fighters moving up. When he's oddly enough, if he ends up fighting someone like Damian Maia, who really is big at getting that takedown, finishing it on the ground. That will be an intriguing matchup, knowing that Woodley's going to be going for the knockout. It'll be interesting if Maia can avoid that right hand and get it to the ground. I'm definitely interested to see that. That could potentially be the next fight at 170 pounds. So
you have to think Woodley-Thompson rematch is on the horizon for sure.
Yeah, I could see that after this plays out. They've talked about the rematch here, but regardless, I think whatever happens in the rematch, eventually the fans are going to want to see Woodley-Maia just for that style matchup. So. I think that if the rematch does happen, I think they'll probably put Maia against someone else. Unfortunately, forever ends up fighting Damian Maia. The streak that Maia's been on, watch out. I think he's destined to fight for that belt pretty soon. So,
all right, let's move on to the next fight here.
We obviously got Jacek and Kovacs. Interesting in this fight, big differences in significant strikes. Really, every phase of the fight. Whether that be body strikes with Jacek with a 33 strike advantage there, 66 leg strikes by Jacek. Kovacs only landing 3, 45 clinch strikes to Jacek, 14 by Kovacs. We talked about Kovacs getting knees in this clinch, getting strikes in the clinch, and you went a bitter at that game, and the fact that we knew Joanna had the advantage on the outside, the fact that she was also able to win that battle on the inside is very impressive. But what is obviously, the one thing you can't take away from Kovacs, if you're looking at damage done in the fight, she really did win in that phase. I mean, she got outstruck, but she really made the most of the strikes that she did land. One of the toughest fights for you in Jacek. What else did you see in that fight that stuck out to you?
Well, this is funny because when you look at the control, it's like pretty much they both controlled it evenly in 3:27 for Jacek. Kovacs had 3 minutes and 20 seconds, and it's interesting because we talk about her slow start. Kovacs really didn't have a fast start for 3 rounds. It took her until the 4th round before she really started to put some hits on Jacek, and those hits were. She almost that was the first time in Jacek's career that she was knocked up against the cage, and like had to deal with that in UFC. Like it's just just
she's been tested a few times.
I think that was maybe her biggest. I don't think she was used to that.
Claudia Gadelha, a lot of people thought the first fight with Claudia Gadelha, Claudia won that. I mean, Claudia outpointed Jacek in a lot of people's scorecards. If you're talking about pure physical damage, this may have been the worst fight for Jacek. But I think she's had worse fights on a scorecard than this fight. This fight, she clearly won on the scorecard.
Yeah, and really
she didn't really win on her face. But in terms of her past, I think she's improved tremendously. This shows a lot of improvement. Her early fights were she did have a lot of close decisions. It's nice seeing her pull away. But this fight did show that she's still beatable. So.
Yeah, and that's what I saw. I thought Kovacs could have definitely won if she played like she did in those last couple rounds. But, sometimes that's what happens. You're trying to field people out, and all that time passes. Right. And you look at the significant strikes, too. 171 out of her 181 strikes for Jacek were significant, and she was 48% total, so pretty much 50%. Right. So she was hitting most of them. 26% for Kovacs, and a lot of that was in those first 3 rounds. She just wasn't connecting. She just, essentially allowed Jacek to just kind of control the match with that sprawl and maul technique, and didn't do what she needed to do to stop that. And it was pretty much a boxing match. No wrestling by either, but there was a takedown for Jacek at the end over there. But.
Right. What's very interesting is moving on to the next fight with Romero Weidman. Obviously, the crazy finish in that. The big thing coming with that crazy finish is Romero's the one of only 2 fighters to have 2 fights end with a flying knee. I mean, obviously that flying knee kind of, in my opinion, represents what had happened that whole fight with. Romero was really timing the shots by Weidman very well. Mm-hmm. Previously, he had timed those by purely his takedown defense, obviously stuffing 7 of Weidman's 8 takedowns. But I think that time you look at it, he had gotten that timing so well down that he kind of channeled Michael Venom Page in his victory over Cyborg. That horrific flying knee that cracked his skull. It kind of felt like that, landed it perfectly as Weidman was coming in for that shot. So I think that was the thing. I think Weidman was telegraphing his shots. He was really lunging for him. As we talked about in our keys, he didn't really use his length to contain Romero, so then he could come in for a quick shot, short shot. He was really reaching for those shots, and it really, whether he was growing for a single leg while he was trying for, a really aggressive double leg. He was getting caught by Romero, whether just by a quick sprawl, Romero's willingness to be able to win in the clinch. I thought it was a really big deal, and him landing that flying knee was kind of indicative of what he had done the whole fight previous. So I'm not. The way that fight was going, I guess we shouldn't have been as surprised by that as we were. But wow,
it was interesting watching it too, because I don't know about you, but for me, watching Weidman, it looked like he actually was maybe winning a decision if it went there. But then when you look at these stats and you're like, whoa, like it almost like it's like Romero slowly crept up to have a great stat sheet here. Both of them didn't land a lot of strikes. It was only 27 to
Right.
16, but 53% for Romero and only 29% for Weidman. And then you talk about the take. When you're 1 for 8 in takedowns, and that was really what Weidman needed to do to beat Romero. And then Romero on the other end, 2 for 3, so he takes advantage of that, and sort of flipped it on Weidman and took out that chance at a victory for him.
Well, and this now is the 8th consecutive victory for Romero. So again, you got to think if he, obviously he and Michael Bisping had a moment after the fight. Bisping flipped him off. Romero's calling him out. Looks like that possibly could go down, which is a bit of a surprise because what we talked about is I was really thinking, with what we were kind of thinking if it was going to be a very close fight, but with such a convincing win, I think Romero kind of may jump the line a little bit with how dominant he was over Weidman. To be honest, I wouldn't be upset with watching Bisping Romero. Obviously, I think Rockhold does eventually deserve a shot back at Bisping. I wouldn't be offended by seeing Rockhold fight Romero. But I think it looks like they're probably just going to end up with a Romero-Bisping fight coming up, which would be interesting.
Very interesting.
Especially since Bisping has gotten clocked in his last couple fights, but has survived. It'll be really interesting to see if Yoel can kind of do a similar thing that he did to Weidman for Bisping, and see if Bisping can really keep that chin going as hard as he has been. I mean, the way that he was able to survive against Dan Henderson, you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, but you got to question how many times can he go through a fight like that.
Yeah,
so
exactly.
That'll be exciting to watch. I guess moving on from that fight, we had a bit of an interesting fight with Raquel Pennington, Misha Tate.
Yeah.
Pennington really seemed to win the battles and the significant strikes. That seemed to be the biggest thing going in that fight. Her accuracy and just her ability to hold off Tate's wrestling, I think, really won the fight for her. So. What do the numbers tell us?
And the numbers tell us that same thing. First of all, 6 minutes and 37 seconds of octagon control to 4:38. That show, and when you have 72% accuracy on total strikes, 111 of them. So she not only landed a lot, but was incredibly accurate. Also had an advantage in the significant strikes, 43 to 21. And it's not like Tate was so bad, but she didn't land. She only landed 48 strikes and was 52%. And when you compare those, I mean, she just took a beating, boxing-wise. And then 1 for 5 on takedowns was Tate. So she wasn't able to sort of utilize that part of her game. There was a couple of times when it looked like she had a chance to maybe try and go for submission, but never was able to. And it was actually Pennington that had 3 submission attempts to her 0. So, I mean, I think Pennington took Tate out of her game. And then, of course, the big news, her retiring after that. And you could almost, maybe she just didn't have the energy in that one. Maybe she didn't have the mental.
And I think it's a smart move for her. She has opportunities outside of fighting. If she's not feeling it anymore, if she, she's made it to the pinnacle of the sport. She always said it was her dream to be champion. She achieved that goal. I think she's realizing, it's not worth going through these wars anymore. She's obviously had to deal with the fact that she's been able to breathe through her nose for years. I think she wants to finally have that back, and I think she's, it's sad to see her go, but I think it's the right decision for her. You may as well go out when there's still kind of the memory of you being the champion. I think
exactly.
It's a wise decision for her. And obviously you already have Rousey talking about seeing the end. I think we have seen the kind of the passing of the guard here in the women's bantamweight division, and I think
it's interesting to see
Shevchenko kind of are the future. So we'll see.
And Pennington, if she keeps having those types of performances,
right? Pennington is a little bit older, but she has kind of come on late, and we'll see if she can use that experience moving up in the division. Obviously, she's going to move up from 8, most likely to 4th, 5th in the division. So
I think it's good for UFC
5,
too when you think about it, because I know Tate, and even if Rousey ends up retiring, they kind of got the women's bantamweight like in the news. People are thinking about it. It builds the weight class, and I feel like we're starting to see more and more women come out and look very tough, which probably went into Tate's decision. It's hard for her to compete with some of these up and comers at this point.
Well, if we want to move on, let's really quick touch on.
We'll just quick go through some of these.
Edgar Stevens, obviously that was an interesting one.
Yeah.
The question there was whether Edgar would win the points fight. or Stevens would win the power game. Obviously, as it turned out, Edgar did win the points fight here.
Yeah. Mostly on control too.
And the very interesting thing to look at here. Obviously, we know about how many strikes Edgar has a tendency to land in a fight. He moves to 1,306 significant strikes in his career, which is number 2 all time behind middleweight champion Michael Bisping. So, big feat there. But Stevens does, what's very interesting is he does move into 6th all time in terms of total octagon time. Stevens has passed the 5-hour mark inside the octagon, which is a very impressive mark.
Yeah, it is. Only
while
18 seconds
Edgar
of
ranks
control.
first in total fight time, which is very interesting. That was a very experienced.
You could kind of see that too with some of these stats too, because Edgar won on control. Obviously, they only scored 18 seconds of control for Stevens in that fight, and that's because 5 takedowns for Edgar.
Right.
And he was 5 for 14 though, so Stevens did play some decent
Stevens
defense.
fought really well, but I mean Edgar is such a hummingbird in the way he moves. Never really is settled in one spot for you to land that power punch. It'll be interesting to see if Edgar can continue to impress at the 145. Obviously with a loss to Aldo, but it'll be interesting if Aldo comes back. I could see him rematching against Edgar and see where that belt goes. If Aldo does walk away, I feel like that they're going to have a fight here for the 145-pound belt with Conor vacating. And I would assume Edgar would be in that fight. With this one over Stevens, I think that Max Holloway, Frankie Edgar would be the fight,
which
if
would be
Aldo was not.
Which would be another very intriguing fight.
Right, which I would be very excited to see. Moving on, obviously we also have Khabib and Michael Johnson. Really cool here. Khabib becomes one of 7 fighters in UFC history to win their first 8 bouts. In that group, you have some great names: Anderson Silva, Royce Gracie, Junior Dos Santos, Chris Weidman, John Fitch, Lyoto Machida. So it kind of goes into some big company there. It's kind of cool is 637 days since the last Kimura submission in UFC competition. Ray Borg tapped Chris Kalades last time in a UFC fight night. And we also have a pretty interesting stat here with, again, we know that Nurmagomedov likes to land strikes when he's on top of the ground, and 120 total strikes by Nurmagomedov. Johnson clearly won that battle on the feet in terms of strikes, but Nurmagomedov really poured it on when he had him on the ground, and really those strikes are what led to the submission. A really deep Kimura was hard to watch. You really thought Johnson's arm was going to snap. I'm glad the official stepped in and called it. It was one of the deepest Kimuras we've seen in a long time, and like I said, over a year since we've seen, almost a couple years since we've seen the last one. So very interesting to watch.
Yeah, and when you look at the stats here, it definitely points to a domination by Khabib. 8 minutes and 35 seconds to control. They awarded no seconds to control to Johnson. That's crazy. Accurate, 74%, 140 strikes. Out of those, 94 significant. Only 20 strikes for Johnson. 19 of them were significant, so he made his strikes count, but 24% accuracy. And then, of course, 2 for 6 takedowns for Khabib. When he was able to get Johnson on the ground, Johnson really had nothing. And that's what led to the submission attempt. Johnson did reverse him for a second and almost had a submission of his own, but Khabib got out of it really quick. Nothing really surprising to me. I really expected Khabib to win this, and like you said, probably puts himself into that title picture now to try and go for the title. So.
Right. I think the only thing we'll talk about left on this card before we kind of go into our final thoughts is the Jim Miller-Thiago Alves fight.
Yeah.
Alves, as we talked about, was incredibly sluggish because he was forced to stay within a 7-pound limit to Jim Miller. The agreed upon conditions that Miller's camp and Alves' camp came to essentially meant that Alves never got the opportunity to fully hydrate. Shows the importance of making weight, especially in New York. And as we talked about, I think moving forward, the UFC is going to be very cautious with the types of fighters they put on New York cards, now having a familiarity with these rules. you got to think that they're going to avoid situations like this. Anything that could potentially ruin the card or put bad fights. That maybe was the only fight on there that was a little disappointing just based on how noticeably sluggish he seemed. I think that the UFC is going to learn from that moving forward. So, I guess we have some 5 thoughts, some 5 points moving forward in the future here. What do you got for us?
So 5 takeaways from this. Obviously, I want to touch on the history of McGregor, because that's to hold 2 belts simultaneously. Like, yes, he becomes part of a very great group of athletes that have had the 2 belts in MMA, but I believe this has happened in other leagues, but for UFC to have the 2 belts, it kind of shows his dominance in UFC right now. And also, I mean, now he's going to go on a break of his kid. What a way to go on a break. You get 2 belts now. Right. There's all kinds of talk about him possibly fighting like a Woodley at once, which is, like you said, it's probably just talk.
It's just talk, yeah.
But
I think he's
it shows that,
55.
yeah, and I think that's the big takeaway is by making history, I think we saw the history of McGregor being at 155. Yeah.
The only thing you kind of feel bad for is Conor wins the 155-pound belt. Just as Khabib proves he needs that title shot. Yeah. And what does McGregor say? I'm taking a break.
Yeah.
And you can very well see if with a break, hype's going to build for McGregor. Is the UFC going to be forced to throw a name McGregor's way, and Khabib forced to sit again and wait for a chance at the lightweight title?
Which is terrible for Khabib.
Yeah, which, I mean, he's undefeated in the sport. Again, as we talked about, now 8 wins to start his UFC career. I really think he deserves to fight for a belt early and often. It'll be interesting to see, with McGregor going on a break, do they introduce an interim champ for that weight class? McGregor, obviously didn't like it the last time they did that with 145, but I could see the UFC doing that. It'll be interesting. I think that obviously they're going to let the dust settle with this. They're going to probably give it a couple weeks, see how the next couple fight nights go. Yeah. It'll be interesting to see what the UFC does going moving forward, because obviously, that does, again, stall another division that McGregor's become the champ of. So
yeah,
I can understand that UFC fighters possibly getting upset with the long jam. So.
My second takeaway, I felt that the first fight in New York was an amazing success for UFC. Not only did they make a lot of money, but I think at their viewership is up. And obviously the card was amazing, and it really shows the potential of New York as well.
And let's talk about the fact that the UFC has its biggest pay-per-view. They have the biggest viewership on FS1, all in a year where the NFL is struggling to get viewerships. Now, not obviously saying that this fight compared, the overall NFL viewership, but it does speak volumes about the fact that the UFC is able to find, to get in touch with fans who have maybe become disheartened with some other sports, aren't viewing these events as regular. It shows the importance of doing a Super Bowl-esque card. Ariel Wani has already reported that there are speculation that the UFC has already made deals to have this fight again. Yes, again in November.
In MSG.
So kind of making a November card in UFC at MSG, kind of a UFC Super Bowl. So I think that's a good idea moving forward. You come in with that after baseball ends, before the NFL playoffs, while the NBA season is young, and while college basketball is still young. I think that the UFC could own the month of November moving forward, and you could see a lot of fights being centered around that New York kind of November time frame.
Mm-hmm.
I could see fights at MSG. Obviously, like we talked about in November, maybe a few more during the year, but I also think that they're going to try to get into Barclays Center. Obviously, they're going to be fighting in Albany. But I think that the UFC and the relationship in New York will continue to get better. It was nice seeing Dana White allude to the politics that had held the UFC out of the state for a long time. I'm happy he addressed those, and this is the UFC's opportunity to prove those naysayers wrong. So
yeah. Another takeaway, of course, is that majority draw and how judging is a real problem, and why we don't want things to go to decisions. The 10-8s, like we talked about those a lot, and there were 10-8s in here. It was just weird given how they were given out, and then we're talking about the Woodley Thompson. For one judge, first round 10-8, fourth round 10-9. Another judge, first round 10-9, fourth round 10-8. And if you saw the fourth round, you're like, okay, like if you're going to give the first round a 10-8, how do you not give the fourth round a 10-8?
Yeah, and that's what upsets me.
Especially in a championship fight, like how as judges, how do you not give the points? You know.
But I want to bring up something with that, with the judging, and with the technology that we have, you got to wonder why we're not putting judges at a desk where they have multiple camera views, because the one thing, and I was talking about this with you before we started here, that we've got to remember that 2 of the 3 judges have an obscured view of the octagon. They're put on the octagon sides with the door, so they have the most. They actually sometimes have the worst view in the entire house. So sometimes we wonder and we groan at the decisions. While I sit there and I wonder how much of that is because where some of that action was taking place on the ground, things like that. If people didn't witness how active Woodley was, you could maybe see how maybe that score drifts from that 10-8 to a 10-9.
Yeah.
You can see how that could create the consistency. So to me, I feel like offering the ability for these judges to even if it's even in between rounds, them to be able to review some video and get a better look. I don't think anyone could complain with that. I think that it would. Why wouldn't you want the judges to have a complete picture after every single round? That's one of the things I'd like to see the UFC improve. We have so often now in the NFL, half the officiating takes place in a booth upstairs, hundreds of feet away from the actual action. Maybe putting officials. Do you have a judge up in a box somewhere? Do you have the judges, like I said, even sitting at kind of a scoring table set up where they have the camera views with them? Something I think would improve consistency in scoring moving forward. Because I think that anytime we see these wildly different scores by judges, we forget about that. They also are all getting very different views of the action.
Yeah.
And when you watch it on TV, you always have a great angle. You always see the action. You get to see these replays, and the people scoring the fight never get to see any of it.
Yeah, which is interesting because it doesn't seem that hard to set them up with the proper equipment to be able to do that.
If Joe Rogan and Mike Goldberg have access to be able to use that stuff, why can't we offer that same thing to the judges?
Exactly.
And that's what sort of upsets me.
You could also think to these title fights, if you do end up bringing it a draw, maybe there's a tiebreaker point. You look at all of their hits and everything you can break down, and you can say, okay, like based on the tiebreaker, we give it to him.
Right, and now obviously the default tiebreaker when there's a belt is if there's a draw, obviously you keep your belt.
Keep your belt.
But the thing is yes, to be able to, certainly in a championship fight, to list something other than a draw, because a draw in a championship fight is confusing because the belt doesn't change hands, but it can't say the other guy technically lost. Now, again, depending on how we scored the fight, we do see it as a clear win by Woodley. Yeah. But I think that you're seeing even baseball embrace video technology. I think the UFC is going to have to adapt more and more moving forward. We'll see what happens. Obviously, they're changing some rules purely with the way that they're officiating the fights. So the UFC in this past year has shown the foresight to move forward. Obviously, we have a change in the way that we do weigh-ins. So who knows? Maybe next year they'll take a look at this. Obviously, Dana White and the UFC has always been vocal about their complaints about judges.
Yeah.
And I think that them willing to work with the athletic commissions to try to come up with some sort of compromise to better score the fights would just be better for everybody.
Yeah, absolutely. My last 2 takeaways are stuff we've kind of touched on, but just to reiterate them. Number 4, obviously the crazy way that Tate retired was interesting because nobody knew she was going to retire, and then she ends up retiring afterward. And it makes you think about, the energy and maybe the motivation she had during the fight. It was going to be her last fight. She knew it. Nobody else did, but maybe her heart wasn't in it as much. And what I take away from it is this going to be the same thing we get from Rousey, who's already talked about it?
I do see those as similar paths. Obviously, Misha being a little bit more active recently. she may be in the situation where you have the emotional dump of becoming the champion. You know, you lose your title, life goes on. You know, and maybe she realizes, you know, I reached the top of the mountain. How much more joy am I going to get out of killing myself to try to get there?
Yeah.
I think she's been in the last 2 wars she's been in, the 2 losses she's taken. I think she's felt that she's ready to, like we talked about earlier, move on to that next chapter in her life.
Yeah.
And I think she's earned that. Again, sad to see her go, but I think she's making a good decision.
Mm-hmm.
So.
And lastly, you know, we touched on this too, but talking about the Super Bowl of the UFC and how real it can be with the success we saw in this one. And if they start to do something like this every year, you know, maybe you see them move to two times. Like, you know, one time maybe early spring, the November one. You could have one West Coast, one Europe, or something like that.
Yeah, you're going to see the 2 capitals. Obviously, Las Vegas is always going to be the capital of UFC. But New York, I think, is going to be that second home. I think that you're going to see probably something early in the year, usually in Vegas, and then I think something at the end of the year in New York. Maybe big European cards or kind of international cards in the middle of the year.
Yeah,
you might start to see the UFC kind of develop a set schedule here, where they have particular locations that they try to identify and own certain months. Obviously, the UFC benefiting from having a year-long schedule. You know, there's not a season for MMA. Really allows them to cherry pick certain months, certain kind of voids in the sports world. And I think if they continue to wisely do that, the sport's just going to continue to grow. Like I said, they fit this card into sort of a sports lull coming out after the World Series. I think this is going to be an indication of things to come, where they're going to start, like I said, cherry picking months here and really kind of coming up with established big cards. So a little less random probably going forward on when these big cards occur.
Yeah, and of course I know you do as well. These awesome cards, like they're fantastic as anybody who likes MMA and you know, watches UFC. These are the cards that you pretty much dream about all year with the sport.
Right. And you know, these are the ones that bring in the average fans. The key is you get someone to watch a fight like this, a fight card like this, and that's how you grab fans to maybe watch the 206s coming up after. Hey, there's some good fights on that too. Yeah. Maybe that would be worth.
And I think they did a nice lead in too with having the Ferguson, you know, fight the week before on Fight Night, and you kind of build everything around it. And
I think they learned that lesson early on. You even saw them do that a little bit with 200. Make sure that they pack that week ahead of time. But you know, I think New York is going to be kind of the second home, and maybe the Super Bowl, kind of the UFC moving forward. Obviously, Vegas is never going to not be the capital of fighting, but we'll see moving forward if New York just continues to become, like I said, that second home. So we'll see. Absolutely.
I hope you guys enjoyed this. I had a blast watching it and talking it with all of you that watched it. So thanks a lot. Heelhooked MMA. You can follow us on Twitter, Heelhooked MMA Heelhooked _ MMA. Right. And you know, we do fan fight companions, and we'll try to do this podcast as much as we can, and have you know, different analysis throughout the weeks as we go. So thanks a lot, guys.